While fixing the leaking water heater barefoot in ice water, I heard my wife laughing upstairs. If he gets electrocuted, we save on bills. I thought it was just a joke until I realized the truth. That night, I packed a bag. 2 weeks later, they weren't laughing anymore. Stay connected for the full story. Ethan stood barefoot in the freezing water that had spread across the basement floor, his breath coming out in short, visible puffs. The old water heater had given up at the worst possible time. Just when he thought he'd have a quiet weekend to catch up on sleep and finally watch that documentary Olivia had been nagging him about. Instead, here he was, knees aching, hands raw from twisting an old, rusted pipe, his socks soaked in icy water that had already crept into every corner of the basement. The air was damp with the smell of metal and mildew, and the single light bulb overhead flickered slightly, casting long shadows against the cracked cement walls. His toolbox sat open beside him, the contents scattered haphazardly as he tried to find the right wrench for the job. Water dripped from the pipe above, each drop hitting the waterlogged floor with a soft, steady plop, mocking his efforts. He adjusted his grip on the wrench, gritting his teeth as he applied more pressure, but the pipe refused to budge. "Come on, you piece of," he muttered, his voice barely above a growl. Then, from above, through the thin ceiling, he heard it. Laughter. Not just any laughter. Olivia's laughter. Bright, light, full of something that made his grip on the wrench tighten involuntarily. And she wasn't alone. A man's voice followed, deeper, smoother, weaving through her giggles like an intimate melody. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, then resumed at double the pace. He stilled, his muscles locked in place, listening intently, willing himself to believe it was nothing. Just someone she knew. A friend. A neighbor. Hell, maybe she was on the phone. But the way they laughed together, it was familiar, warm, shared. A laugh like that wasn't just polite. It was knowing. Ethan exhaled sharply, forcing his focus back on the stubborn pipe. He was being ridiculous. Olivia had always been the social one between them, the kind of woman who made friends effortlessly, who could charm an entire room within minutes. It was one of the things he had loved about her from the start, that easy, inviting warmth. He shouldn't be reading into this. And yet, as another round of laughter trickled down to him, his fingers clenched harder around the wrench, his knuckles whitening. It had been a long week. Maybe that was why he felt so damn on edge. Work had been relentless, late nights, early mornings, his boss breathing down his neck about deadlines. He hadn't been home as much as he should have. Maybe he and Olivia just needed to reconnect. A date night. Something simple. The wrench slipped from his grip and clattered onto the concrete floor, sending a sharp sound through the silent basement. He cursed under his breath, rubbing his temples as he let out a slow exhale. He was overreacting. Still, he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at his gut. Carefully, he reached for his phone, flipping it over in his palm. A quick text wouldn't hurt. Just something casual. "Hey, who's over?" Maybe even add a little joke. Tell them to come fix the heater while they're at it. His thumb hovered over the screen. Then, another laugh. And this time, it wasn't just laughter. It was Olivia's voice, lowered, intimate in a way that made something deep in Ethan's chest tighten. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone, the softness, sent a cold wave through him, one even the icy water around his feet couldn't match. The room suddenly felt smaller, claustrophobic. The air was thick, pressing against his lungs as the pieces of his thoughts began shifting, forming something he didn't want to acknowledge. He forced himself to move, to pick up the wrench again, to push the thought away. It was nothing. Nothing. But as the laughter above continued, as light footsteps moved across the floor, as his wife's voice softened into something almost secretive, Ethan couldn't stop the sinking feeling creeping in. And for the first time, standing there in the freezing water, he wondered if something in his life, something much bigger than a broken water heater, was about to burst apart. Ethan forced himself to focus on the leaking pipe, tightening the wrench with renewed determination. He had always been good at fixing things, small household problems, a broken chair, a leaking faucet, but this moment felt different. The cold water soaked through his jeans as he shifted his weight, the muscles in his arms straining as he twisted the metal. But no matter how much force he applied, the pipe wouldn't budge. He gritted his teeth, his frustration mounting. He wasn't just fighting a rusted pipe. He was battling the thoughts in his head, the nagging voice whispering that something was off. Olivia's laughter still floated down from the living room, light and carefree, but now, every sound felt like a dagger to his chest. Ethan prided himself on being rational, logical. He wasn't the jealous type. He had never been the kind of husband to check his wife's phone, to question her friendships. Olivia had always been independent, always had her own life outside of their marriage, and he had respected that. But this felt different. He turned off the wrench for a moment and reached for his phone again. The water heater was still hissing, the pressure building, but it was nothing compared to the pressure mounting in his chest. He typed out a message. "Hey, who's over?" He stared at the screen. His thumb hovered over the send button. He hesitated. What was he afraid of? That she wouldn't reply? That she would? He clenched his jaw and erased the text. He was being ridiculous. He was standing here like some paranoid idiot while Olivia was probably just catching up with an old friend. Hell, maybe it was her brother, maybe it was one of her coworkers. And yet, deep down, he knew better. The way they laughed, the way their voices dipped low, intimate. He knew Olivia. He knew how she sounded when she was comfortable with someone, when she let her guard down. That wasn't how she laughed with acquaintances. That wasn't casual. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. Maybe he should just go upstairs, make his presence known, walk in casually, ask if she needed anything, remind himself there was nothing to worry about. Or maybe he should wait. Wait and listen. The thought made his stomach churn. What kind of husband lurked in his own basement, spying on his wife? He had never been that man. But right now, standing in the freezing water, listening to the soft murmurs above him, he felt like a stranger in his own home. Then, footsteps. Soft, slow, moving across the living room. He could picture it in his mind. Olivia walking across the hardwood floor, the way her bare feet barely made a sound. Another set of footsteps followed, heavier, more deliberate. A man's. Ethan clenched the wrench so tightly his knuckles turned white. The murmur of voices grew quieter, like they had moved closer together. He strained to hear, but the distance, the thickness of the floor, made it impossible to catch the words. And then, silence. His heart pounded. Seconds passed. A minute. Then, Olivia's voice, soft, almost a whisper. And the man's, lower, steady. Something inside Ethan snapped. He dropped the wrench, the metal clanging loudly against the cement. He didn't care anymore. He needed to see for himself. Stepping carefully out of the water, he moved toward the basement stairs. His socks squelched with every step, but he barely noticed. His pulse roared in his ears as he reached the bottom of the stairs and placed his hand on the railing. He hesitated. If he was wrong, if this was all just some stupid misunderstanding, then what? What did it say about him that he had let his mind go this far? But if he was right, he exhaled slowly and took the first step. The stairs creaked beneath his weight. He moved carefully, deliberately, climbing one step at a time. The voices above remained low, murmured, like a conversation meant to be private. He reached the door at the top of the stairs. His hand hovered over the knob. Then, laughter again. Close. Right on the other side of the door. Ethan didn't think. He turned the knob and stepped through. And then, he saw them. Ethan stepped into the kitchen, his wet socks squelching against the floor, his heartbeat a hammer against his ribs. The cold air of the basement clung to his skin, but his body felt hot. Too hot, as adrenaline surged through him. His eyes scanned the room in an instant. Olivia stood near the couch, her back half turned toward him, a wine glass in her hand. The dim glow from the living room lamp cast a warm light on her skin, catching in the strands of her dark hair. She was smiling, her lips slightly parted mid-laugh. And then, there was him. A man, tall, dressed in a dark button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his lean frame angled slightly toward Olivia. His stance was relaxed, confident, too comfortable. Ethan felt his stomach knot. The man wasn't sitting across from her. He wasn't on the other end of the room. He was close. Too close. Close enough that if Olivia turned just slightly, their hands would brush. Close enough that Ethan didn't need to hear the words to know the kind of conversation they had been having. For a moment, the world narrowed. The cold air, the dripping water from his clothes, the steady hum of the broken heater, all of it faded into the background. All he could hear was his own heartbeat. Then Olivia turned. Her eyes met his. And just like that, the moment shattered. Her smile faltered for the briefest second, so brief that if Ethan hadn't been looking for it, he might have missed it. But he saw it. That tiny flicker of surprise. The way her fingers tensed around the stem of the wine glass before she smoothed her expression into something neutral, something effortless. "Ethan," she said, her voice light, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "I didn't hear you come up." The man turned slightly, his expression unreadable. He had the kind of face Ethan might have ignored on any other day. Sharp features, a well-groomed beard, an easy, practiced smile. The kind of face that belonged to someone who was used to being liked. Ethan took a step forward, the wetness from his socks spreading onto the floor beneath him. He didn't care. "Yeah," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "I was fixing the water heater." "Oh." Olivia glanced at the damp spots on his clothes, the way his hair was slightly disheveled. "Did you get it working?" Ethan barely heard the question. His eyes were locked on the man in front of him, waiting. The man met his gaze, then, after a beat, extended a hand. "Hey," he said smoothly. "I'm Daniel." Ethan didn't move. Daniel let his hand hover in the air for a second before slowly lowering it, stuffing it casually into his pocket like he didn't care. A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Olivia shifted slightly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Daniel's an old friend," she said, too casually. "We went to college together." That wasn't an answer. Not really. Ethan forced himself to breathe through the tightness in his chest. He turned to Daniel. "I don't think Olivia mentioned you." Daniel's lips curved into a slow, easy grin. "Oh well, I guess I'm one of those people who just pop in and out of life." Ethan clenched his jaw. Olivia stepped forward slightly, placing a gentle hand on Ethan's arm. "Daniel was just in town for a few days. I ran into him earlier, and we decided to catch up." Catch up. The words tasted bitter in Ethan's mind. "Right," Ethan said. Silence. Daniel took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze flicking between Ethan and Olivia as if he was watching a silent conversation unfold. Then, setting his glass down, he smiled again, easy, confident. "Well," he said, stretching slightly, "I should probably get going. Didn't mean to overstay my welcome." Ethan didn't move. Olivia hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, of course. It was good seeing you." Daniel turned to her, and for the briefest moment, Ethan saw it. That look. It was fast, subtle, just a flicker in his eyes, a moment of something unspoken passing between them. But it was there, and Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. Daniel grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, sliding it on with an easy familiarity. "Nice meeting you, Ethan," he said with a small nod. Ethan didn't respond. Daniel's lips twitched, amused, before he turned toward the door. Olivia followed, walking him out, her voice soft, murmured. Ethan couldn't make out the words. And then, the door closed. The lock clicked, and Olivia turned back toward him, smiling, as if nothing had happened. "So," she said lightly, "did you fix the heater?" Ethan stared at her. 100 things ran through his mind. 100 things he wanted to ask. But all he could do was stand there, still dripping, still cold, as something inside him cracked open. And he realized, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ethan stood in the middle of the living room, his wet socks soaking into the hardwood floor, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Olivia moved around him effortlessly, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just walked another man to the door and exchanged that quiet, unreadable look. That look, Ethan couldn't shake it. It wasn't the look of two friends catching up after years apart. It wasn't polite, it wasn't casual. It was something else, something deeper. Something that made his skin prickle. He clenched his fists at his sides. "So," Olivia said again, brushing a hand through her hair. "Did you fix the heater?" Ethan didn't answer. His eyes were locked on her, watching, waiting. She paused for half a second, so brief that anyone else wouldn't have noticed. But Ethan did. "I'll take that as a no," she said, flashing a small smile as she walked toward the kitchen. The sound of a wine bottle being set down, the clink of a glass. Everything about her was calm. Too calm. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You didn't tell me anyone was coming over," he said finally. Olivia turned slightly, her expression unreadable. "It was last minute. I ran into him earlier today, and we decided to catch up." Ethan nodded, though the words felt hollow. "Funny," he said, his voice controlled but sharp. "You never mentioned him before." Olivia let out a soft, almost amused breath. "Ethan, I went to college with a lot of people. I don't tell you about every single person I run into." He ignored the way his stomach twisted at that. Didn't seem like just a random run-in. Olivia arched an eyebrow. And what's that supposed to mean? Ethan didn't answer right away. He studied her instead. The way she leaned slightly against the counter. The way her fingers rested lightly on the rim of her wine glass. As if she were unbothered. As if this entire situation was just another conversation to get through. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe it's the way you two were laughing together. Maybe it's the way he stood next to you like he belonged here. Maybe it's the fact that when I walked in, neither of you looked surprised to see me. Olivia's lips pressed together for the briefest second before she took another sip of her wine. You're overthinking this. Am I? He wanted to ask her. He wanted to demand an answer. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them. Then, quietly, he said, How long has this been going on? The words were out before he could stop them. Olivia's fingers tightened slightly around the glass. Excuse me. Ethan took a step closer, his wet socks making a faint sound against the floor. How long, Olivia? His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes right before something breaks. She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. You're being ridiculous. Am I? He tilted his head, watching her. Then tell me the truth. I did tell you the truth, she shot back, her voice sharper now. Daniel's an old friend. That's it. Ethan let out a slow breath. Then why do I feel like you're lying? Olivia's jaw tightened. Maybe because you're looking for something that isn't there. Or maybe, Ethan said evenly, because something is there, and you just don't want to admit it. Silence. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Olivia's face. Something unreadable. Something not quite guilt, but not quite innocence either. Ethan felt the weight of it settle in his chest. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to be wrong. But deep down, something told him he wasn't. Finally, Olivia set her wine glass down with a soft clink. I think, she said, her voice softer now, that you're exhausted. You've had a long week. Maybe you should get some rest. Ethan stared at her, and for the first time he realized. This wasn't a conversation. It was a warning, a way of telling him to let it go. But he couldn't, because now, every touch, every glance, every time Olivia had smiled at him over the past few months, he would wonder. He would question, and something between them had already cracked. Maybe it wasn't broken yet, but it would be. The end.